Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, finally, I'm talking about the sixth and final album from 808 State, Outpost Transmission. Right, so we just came off the heels of an album that I consider to be in my top 4 of all time. Well, I say off the heels, but there's no context in which that phrasing entirely works. I've posted 5 other videos since that review, and this album itself came after a 6-year hiatus. So, yeah, point is, these guys were going to be following up Don Solaris. Now, there was not much of a high chance of topping that one, especially in my eyes. In fact, I didn't even bother hearing anything from this album until several years after I'd heard all of 90. As a kid, most of my iTunes money went towards those 4 middle albums, even though Outpost Transmission was right there available to me the whole time. It never seemed to grab me in the same way their other stuff did, and I was far from the only person who appeared to have that opinion. This is their least popular album, and their least, well, publicly received in general from what I can tell. Seems the general consensus is that it's fine, but nothing special. The question is, do I agree with said consensus? Well, if you'd asked me a year or 2 ago, I'd have said yes. But that's not so much the case anymore now. In the past couple of months, this album actually did really click for me in a way I'd not really expected previously. It's taken a lot of repeat listens over many years to fully put together how I feel and why it's had such a hard time clicking previously. But I feel like I do have my head wrapped around it now. I'll admit, even after it finally clicking for me, I'd still be lying if I said this album was on par with their previous 4 albums. I still consider it to be among the weakest material they have, but given how consistently I've loved their previous stuff, that's really not saying much. I don't think it's all that far behind when you really get down to it. So before I go down track by track, I'm first gonna have to point out that, annoyingly, this album has 2 different versions between the US and the UK. And I'm used to the US version. That's what was on iTunes before, that's what's on my iPod right now. But it does appear to be the less common track listing. Both versions are on Spotify though, so that's good. Yeah, the 2 versions have 10 tracks in common, but 4 tracks specific to each of them. The UK version has Boogieman, Round Bum Mary, Slow Boat, and Yoyo, while the US version has Quincy's Lunch, Doctors and Nurses, Brown Sauce, and Long Orange Testa. And I've only heard the 4 UK exclusive tracks for the first time in the past few days. I don't believe the difference in quality or overall vision is actually that drastic though. The 2 versions still very much feel like the same album. The US version just happens to be the one I'm used to. So okay, now as I mentioned before, this album did not appear to click with most fans of the band, including myself for a long time, but I realized there's actually a pretty clear reason for the reactions that it got. First of all, this album is easily the most experimental 808 State have ever sounded, and the least poppy as well. Each track is structured just the same, is comprised of most of the same sounds as something from XL or Gorgeous. Hell, I listened to the latter back to back with this one today, and they flowed together surprisingly well. It's an 808 State album through and through, and that much was obvious even from first listen. What was less obvious though was a distinct lack of catchy hooks on this thing. And I don't mean like they tried to form hooks and they weren't catchy. No, there's a lot of tracks here that don't even really try to form hooks at all. And this coming from a band who already has pretty non-linear track structures as is. Basically the final result is these guys basically making their version of the Black Dog Spanners, an album so completely non-linear and odd and strange that it seems to go in one ear and out the other on the first couple of listens, maybe even first 10 listens, but continues to deliver on something new and interesting with each successive listen. Granted, Spanners I still believe to be the superior album, as it's much more consistent than this one even now, but let's go down track by track. So the opener, 606, is basically the only poppy track on the whole album, and easily the catchiest and most accessible in the bunch, with guest vocals from Simeon, who I could have sworn was female, but it's actually a male group. Okay. Regardless, while this track does get points for me purely for being the single pop track on the album, it is actually a really catchy and unique sounding track in their catalog. He's, starting us off on a good note, if not the most fitting. It's the second track, Chopsumwong, where this album really starts to show its true colors. There's no hook at all in the track. It's got a weird time signature, and its strange techno sounds just seem to fly all over the place at random. But there's something strangely alluring about it that's tough for me to put my finger on. Like, it does still establish a pretty cool atmosphere, and it's basically kinda establishes the typical style you're going to get for this album. But like I said, Outpost transmission is still not the most consistent. There's a bit of a lull in terms of track quality that doesn't pick up until much later, and even after that kinda goes back off again. Wheat Straw is another strange track that's basically a two-parter, completely changing tempo and beat in the second half, though both parts keeping this one really off-kilter melody that sometimes kinda gets on my nerves. Yeah, at least I remember it. And then there's Lemon Soul, which is another vocal track, though I hesitate to call it a pop track. It's just kind of this sleepy sounding thing with Guy Garvey kinda aimlessly moaning over it. It's kinda catchy, but it's not really a huge highlight for me. It's kinda boring. Sun Tower is another track that I want to like more than I actually do. It's another kind of abstract IDM sort of thing that kind of floats around in one fairly consistent atmosphere. Like, the synth textures on here, like on Wheat Straw, I'm off and on with. Sometimes they provide that sort of unique Asian flavor that seems to permeate throughout this album for some reason. And sometimes it's more grating than anything, but I do still consistently like this one more than Wheat Straw. Finally, though, the album really hits its stride on the run of tracks from Bent to Quincy's Lunch. 5 great ones in a row. Bent is kinda like a silly villain theme you'd hear in a cartoon or something. Somewhere in between trying to sound like it's sneaking around or spying. And then sometimes it just like sounds faux military or something. I don't know, like those timpani drums give it a uniquely silly and cartoonish vibe to it. And it's actually catchy! The kind of thing that can actually get stuck in your head, unlike the previous 4 tracks. So yeah, that's a really unique and fun track, and it leads right into Souflex, or Souffle, if you want, which sounds like it's something picked out of the last third of Gorgeous. Something like Colony or Storm and Norman. You know, it jumps from hook to hook, but the hooks are all good, and it's a lot of fun. Crossword is the last vocal track on the album, and again, it's not a pop track. It's really noisy and industrial. Heck, if it were not for the appearance of Larry Love on here, this track would not be nearly as memorable as it is. The guy's deep voice talking about, "No, chill out, I cannot cool down." It gives the track a particularly insane and angry vibe. And from there we get Lungfoo, which may very well be my favorite track on the album, primarily because I'm a sucker for vibraphones and this track prominently features those all over it. Again, the melody's actually catchy, and it gives off this really dramatic and dark, but still pretty lighthearted vibe. Do 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 do. Quincy's Lunch is a track that I was previously on the fence over, but now love. The creepy 70s TV orchestra sample at the beginning paired up with a percussive and industrial beat later on alongside a silly voice sample that gets better and catchier every time I hear it. This track actually reminds me quite a bit of the Orbital track I Don't Know You People, which might have contributed to it growing on me the way it did. Now, unfortunately, after this, the album takes another downturn after this and never completely recovers. That run of 5 tracks is easily the highlight of the album, but like tracks after this, while cool and interesting, just don't have the same hook power or standout quality as these previous ones did. More often than not, they all kind of run together and become indistinguishable from each other. But that's not to say they aren't good, because I still really like all of these tracks. Dis, for instance, is probably the track on here that could most easily fit on the Black Dog Spanners. Reminds me vaguely of tracks like Chase the Manhattan. Doctors and Nurses is really creepy and atonal and noisy, but the addition of this one flute sound makes it all the more memorable. Brown Sauce kinda mirrors Chopsumwong in its near-complete lack of structure or hooks, but the really rough and edgy bass guitars on this one are quite appealing. And Long Orange, Testa, while not particularly catchy, does take things out on a satisfying and even cinematic note. The strings and the amen breaks and various other synths come together for a pretty immersive atmosphere. Of course, when I listen to it, I'm like, oh, it's over already? Wasn't I on Dissidus just a few seconds ago? But whatever. Now, as for the 4 UK exclusive tracks, again, these don't have even close to as many repeat listens as the tracks I've already mentioned, but I have formed thoughts on these two. Boogieman has a pretty catchy sample that repeats throughout, and the more rock-influenced sound is pretty cool. Boogieman and the Boogie Woman. Round Bum Mary is a lot of harsh and dark synth noodling. It's fun, but I can't really see becoming a standout for me if I were used to that version of the album. Would probably blend into the previous track too well. Slow Boat is kinda like a less linear version of Sun Tower that is less grating, but not exactly catchier, and of course it is pretty overtly Asian flavored, because, get it, Slow Boat to China. And finally, Yoyo is a pretty nice atmospheric down-tempo thing with some good break beats that I think might actually work as a more effective and well-defined ending to the album than Long Range Testa does. Probably my personal favorite of the UK exclusive tracks there. So finally, thoughts on the album overall. I definitely get why it's not as well loved as their other stuff, and why it's taken such a long time to warm up on me. The entire album is really dark and gritty and noisy. The catchier tracks sound like cartoon villain themes sometimes, and the less catchy tracks are just a giant experimental mess that's a lot more fascinating than it initially lets on. I will say this, even if it is kinda similar to the Black Dog Spanners in its non-linearity and needing lots of repeat listens to fully grow on you, I still think this is a really unique album that is very much 808 State. The giant, dark, and gritty mess with more Asian influence than you might expect still has very well-defined grooves and takes you on a journey just like many of their other previous albums, and it's still a lot of fun to listen to. Like, 808 State's idea of a darker album is one that's basically set in an evil stir-fry restaurant that wants to kill you. Like, despite its weaker spots, it's consistently entertaining. Now, as a send-off to 808 State's entire career, I'm not so sure. Obviously, this came out in 2002, it's almost 16 years old now. 808 State have not released another mainline album since this aside from random archive compilations, and this doesn't feel like it's the notes they plan to go out on. I do kinda wish they would come back and put out a 7th album. Seems like they stopped at the first sign they might be growing stale or mediocre. Though it has also been 16 years since this album came out, they might not have put out any more material because they don't feel like they can live up to what they currently have. I'm still holding out for it to happen. They haven't released a single bad or even not great album yet, after all, but I'll be okay if it turns out they don't want to do another, or if that 7th one happens and it turns out to just be fine. And while I will admit Outpost Transmission is one of their weakest offerings, it is still a really great album that is absolutely worth people's time. One that needs a lot of time to marinate, yes, but one that you really ought to be sinking your teeth into. It's still fresh and spicy all these years later, and even comes with some nice aftertaste. You definitely cannot say this album does not have any flavor. Sorry for all the food jokes that thought it was fitting given how many food-related song titles are in this one, but whatever. I'm overall feeling an 8.3 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.